Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moffman coming at you with another APGov video. This is our third video focusing in on topic 1.8, constitutional interpretations of federalism. And once again, when we're talking about federalism, we are talking about the relationship that exists between the federal government and the state governments. Is this a relationship that is very tight and intertwined? Is it a relationship where they kind of keep separation and distance? Is one branch of government more powerful than the other? In this video, we're going to be taking a look at answering, some of those questions. And when we take a look at, the early interpretation of what federalism is going to be in this country, it really does center in on, on the mind of this individual right here. This is Chief Justice John Marshall. John Marshall, though he will not be the first Chief Justice in the United States, he will be the first Chief Justice in the United States that will have significant influence and power over what the Constitution is going to mean. He's going to be key in asserting the Supreme Court in the early 19th century as a valid, legit third branch of government in relation to the legislative and executive branches. He will be leading the court for nearly 35 years. And at this early, almost embryonic stage in American history post-independence, he's going to be leading the way to kind of, once again, interpreting what the Constitution means. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of it away right off the bat by letting you know that, one of his monikers is going to be him being called the Last Federalist, which kind of gives you a sense right off the bat that when we talk about this relationship between the federal government and the state governments, even though we are now talking about a time in American history where you got Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, those kinds of folks that tended to be more willing to, give more deference, more authority within the state governments vis-a-vis the federal government, Marshall's going to be a totally different character. He is going to be using the Supreme Court to try to assert early on dominance by the federal government as much as possible over the state government. So how is this going to be happening? How is the court going to be moving in this, federalist direction, if you will, with regards to interpreting federalism? Well, that's going to bring us to one of the required cases that we do need to know for this course, and that is going to be the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. Now, McCulloch versus Maryland, like all the other required Supreme Court cases you got to know for this course, you got to know the 5 things. Remember, you got to know the background to the case, you got to know the constitutional issue or issues that are associated with it, who's going to win the case, why, and the lasting impact. So let's go ahead and set the stage, provide some context for this case by talking about the background. Now, this case is going to be centering in on an issue regarding the Bank of the United States. And for those of you that are not familiar with the Bank of the United States, or the BUS as I commonly call it in class, the BUS is going to be created first in the 1790s. It's the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, and it's going to be able to, though it's a technically private bank, it's going to be the depository for federal government funds, and therefore is going to have a significant power over, the federal government's credit, ability to borrow, etc., etc. Now, from its inception, the BUS is going to be very controversial. This is going to be one of the key differences in terms of the values of the emerging Federalist Party and Democratic Republican parties in the 1790s, with Hamilton asserting that not only is the BUS constitutional under the under the Constitution, but it is also necessary. But opponents of the BUS, like Thomas Jefferson, are going to argue that there's nothing in the Constitution that asserts that the federal government has the right to create a bank, which is true. It's not enumerated at all, and therefore it should not be allowed to exist. But Hamilton will counter that by saying, well, hold on a second. The necessary and proper clause does not, or the necessary and proper clause allows the federal government the ability to stretch, hence the nickname elastic clause, to actually use more power than what is just simply enumerated. So that early debate is going to be forming. Now, note, we know the BUS is going to get created as part of a bigger set of deals between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans in the mid-1790s. But that's going to bring us then about a generation later to an incident that's going to be taking place with the BUS vis-a-vis the state of Maryland. Now, the Bank of the United States is going to be having, chapters, if you will, regional, local locations across the country, and one of those will be in the state of Maryland. Branches, if you will. That was the term I was really looking for, branches. And at this Maryland branch of the Bank of the United States, the state of Maryland was attempting to tax it. This will force a lawsuit. Now, with regards to this lawsuit, this is where Chief Justice John Marshall, once again pictured here, is going to be playing a critical role in trying to determine, first off, does this bank have a right to exist under the Necessary and Proper Clause? And if it does have a right to exist, can Maryland tax it? So you're looking at actually a couple of constitutional issues, one tied with the Necessary and Proper Clause and its interpretation, and also this right here focusing in on the Supremacy Clause. So let's first review what the Necessary and Proper Clause says. As you can see there highlighted, it says that the federal government, and note this is in Article 1, Section 8, this is part of what's enumerated for the federal government's powers in the Constitution. It says the federal government shall have the power to make all laws, which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. So basically what this is saying is that not only does the federal government have the ability to do what is enumerated, like declare war, but also has the power via this specific clause to do what is necessary and proper to carry out the powers that are enumerated. And this question then is, is the Bank of the United States valid under that definition? Does the Bank of the United States have a legitimate, necessary, and proper value for carrying out some other enumerated power within the Constitution? And how this is going to be decided is going to have a major impact on how big the federal government is. If you say that the bus does fit within this definition, then you are then going to be expanding the power of the federal government. If you say it doesn't fit in with that, then it limits that federal authority. And once again, if we're going back to our boy John Marshall here, we already kind of know where he's coming from in this federal versus state government debate. He's the last Federalist. And so not a big surprise that when the case is handed down, the court is going to rule that that the bank does have a right to exist. It is constitutional. It is valid to carry out what is needed in the Constitution in terms of what is enumerated. And then the question is, well, what is that enumerated power or powers that are enumerated that the bus does, help to carry out in terms of power? And that's going to be seen in the power to borrow money. It's going to be seen via the power to tax. But to help you, I think, borrowing is probably an easy thing to do. Think about it. You go to a bank, you borrow money. It's the federal government's money in this bank. The federal government will be able to borrow money due to credit established in this bank, all that kind of stuff. So right off the bat, you see federal government authority expand through the court led by Marshall saying that, yes, the bus has a right to exist via the Necessary and Proper Clause. The other bone of contention in this case is, well, all right, the bus might have a right to exist constitutionally, but does the state of Maryland have a right to tax it? And this is going to be decided via interpreting another part of the Constitution. Not even Article 1, which is talking about federal powers being enumerated, but rather Article 6. Article 6 has got some interesting stuff in it, and it includes what we call the Supremacy Clause, which is highlighted right here, which says, this Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. Okay, so in other words, any laws passed by the U.S. government, any laws passed by the federal government, that includes things like treaties, that is going to be the supreme law of the land. So in other words, what the federal government does is what is ultimately supreme in this relationship. It asserts that, in other words, for lack of a better explanation, when there is a conflict between federal authority and state authority, it is the federal government's authority that wins out. Which then applied to this case is then basically begging, well, all right, if that is the case, then can a state use its power to tax a federal government item like the bus. And as you can see here in the notes, John Marshall is going to say, no, they cannot. In one of John Marshall's, more famous quotes, Marshall is going to be writing in the opinion that the power to tax is the power to destroy. That, in other words, if you let the state of Maryland tax the federal government, the bus in this case, then you are saying that the state is supreme over the federal government, that it has more power than the federal government. And the Supremacy Clause is very clear when it says, no, it does not. The states do not have that ultimate supremacy. So once again, if you let the states tax the bus, then you're saying the states are more supreme than the federal government. And that violates this part of the Constitution. You cannot do that. So when we talk about McCulloch versus Maryland, there's a reason why this is a gots-to-know case for the AP test, is that it takes a look at two early interpretations of the Constitution. One, how does federal authority, does it expand or shrink under the necessary and proper clause by this case? It expands. When we talk about testing the supremacy clause, it makes a clear interpretation that no, states cannot violate the supremacy clause. The federal government wins out. And so in this early set of interpretations, the federal government's power is going to expand and expand noticeably. That's going to be very, very significant. So early on, you're going to be seeing McCulloch versus Maryland playing a critical role. All right? We're going to leave it there for right now. We got another video that's going to be taking a look at some other aspects of defining federalism early on in American history, like, for example, Gibbons v. Ogden, but also taking a look at some more contemporary interpretations regarding the Constitution via federalism. So we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.